Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om. Peace, peace, peace. So we are back for another session of Ask Swami, where so many questions which come to us from all over the world through the internet. We select a few, only a few representative questions. And but thanks to all of you who write, and also to our dedicated team who go through all these questions and then make a selection. Obviously, we cannot answer all your questions or discuss all your questions, but in a subject like this, when we're talking about spirituality, about Vedanta, often the questions are common questions. And a question asked by somebody else may be of benefit to me when I listen to the question and the answer carefully. So instead of being eager or impatiently waiting for my question to come up, let's just relax and attend to the questions which do come up and listen to the answers carefully. Yes, Diane.
Yes, Swami. The first question is from Kyle Parson. Does the individual soul or Jivatman exist? If so, what separates it from Brahman or absolute reality?
Does the individual soul, Jivatman, exist? And what separates it from Brahman, the ultimate reality? Look, one thing is, without any doubt, it's obvious that we do exist. I exist. I know I do. I don't know about you, but I do feel that I exist. So the individual does exist. Now, the question is, when we are told about an ultimate reality, an infinite awareness, existence, consciousness, bliss, Brahman, and when we begin to understand what it is, then we naturally wonder about our relationship with that entity. According to Advaita Vedanta, we are that entity. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. If I would investigate my own existence, if I would investigate my own awareness, and Advaita Vedanta helps us to do that. If we do that, then it will be revealed to me that I, this seemingly limited individual, by individual existence, Jivatman, we mean a limited existence. This seemingly limited existence is actually an unlimited existence. By limited and unlimited, again, we have to be clear what we mean. In Advaita Vedanta, the terms are very clear. Limited means limited in time, space, in object, which means I'm only here and not there. I'm only, from this year I was born and that year I shall die. So those are limitations of the body. And they are limitations of the mind. But I, the awareness, and am the unlimited Brahman. This is what Advaita Vedanta tells me. You are that, or I am Brahman. So what is the difference between the limited Jivatman and Brahman? What separates? That was the question. What separates? According to Advaita Vedanta, only ignorance separates us. The individual and the absolute reality Brahman they are separated by ignorance. Whose ignorance? Our ignorance about our real nature. Our ignorance about Brahman, which translates into our ignorance about our real nature. Even more directly and more crudely, a monk put it even more directly. What is the difference between you and the ultimate reality? And he put it in Hindi crudely. I'll translate. He said, "Bevkufi matra hai." Stupidity. The only difference between me and Brahman is my own stupidity, that I don't realize that I am Brahman. So, what differentiates the Jivatman, what separates Jivatman from Brahman? Ignorance, the Jivatman's ignorance about its own reality, which is another way of saying nothing separates us from Brahman. There's nothing that separates us from Brahman. What separates the pot from the clay? If it's a clay pot, what separates the pot from the clay? Nothing, except possibly the pot was ignorant about its nature as clay. What separates the wave from water, the gold ornament from the gold? Nothing. If it was possible for them to be ignorant, they're ignorant about their real nature. That's the only separation, if I may use air quotes. That's the Advaitic answer to the question. Let's take a step back and a broader view. There is the Vishishta Advaitic answer, which is the qualified monastic school of the great master Ramanuja. By the way, when I say Advaita Vedanta of Shankaracharya or Vishishta Advaita of Ramanuja, I feel a little uneasy because the traditional teachers of these schools would not agree. Advaita Vedanta was not founded by Shankaracharya. Vishishta Advaita was not founded by Ramanujacharya. They are traditions which go back centuries, if not millennia, before these great masters. So in their traditions, Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, in their respective traditions, they are known as the great commentators, the ones who wrote the foundational commentaries on the Upanishads, Gita, and so on. Anyway, that's just a technical observation. Now, in the qualified monastic view of Ramanujacharya, the individual and Brahman, the Jiva and Brahman, they are related as part and whole. Brahman is the whole of which Jiva is a part. We are just like hands and feet and fingers. They are all parts of one organic entity called this body. So the parts of a unity called this body. Similarly, all of us, sentient beings, and also this insentient world, this material world, we are all parts, components, tiny bits. One example is of thousands of sparks, millions of sparks of fire emanating from a vast bonfire. And the vast bonfire itself is Brahman or God. So that is the qualified monastic view. Another view would be, we are actually separate. We are actually distinct from Brahman. Brahman is God and we are sentient beings and we are distinct. And we will remain so. And so then we have a loving relationship or a devotional relationship with God. So it could be identity, it could be part whole, or it could actually be difference, strict difference between God and the individual being. Which one is correct? As a non-dualist, I will insist that the non-dual position is correct. But Sri Ramakrishna would say that all of them are correct. Why would all of them be correct, and what's the point in saying they're all correct? Notice, the important thing is to be in touch with, to realize, to connect with, or become one with that ultimate reality. That is the only point that is important. If you can do that, do it by a dualistic way, do it by a qualified monastic way, do it by a monastic, non-dualistic way, whichever way it works and it's liberating, it solves your problem. Somebody asked once, what is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? Is it non-dualistic? Is it dualistic? Is it qualified monastic? Swami Turiyanandaji writes, if you press me for an answer, I will say his philosophy was, realize God by any means whatsoever. Right.
This question is from Dmitry Sladkov. Could you please help me understand the description of self, existence, consciousness, bliss? I understand the existence and bliss. My question is about consciousness. Does it mean that the self can be self-aware without the need of the mind or any object?
So, can the self be self-aware without the need of the mind or any object? First of all, straight answer, no. When you mean by self-awareness that I am aware of myself, deliberately, consciously, as an experience, then obviously one needs the mind, because it's the mind which generates that self-awareness. And not only that, even with the mind, one may not be self-aware. In the sense in which Dimitri is asking, it requires an introspective act, an inward turn of the mind to become self-aware. That I notice, not only do I see the time, I'm aware that I'm aware of the time. So that requires an act of the mind. But again, let's look deeper into the matter. What is an experience? Not just self-awareness, any experience at all. The way we define experiences in Advaita Vedanta would be consciousness plus an object. When consciousness is conscious of an object, that's an experience. Consciousness by itself is not an experience. So an object, any object, and if you actually look at it the way it works, all the objects come to me, the consciousness, through the medium of my mind. I mean, even the time, when I'm looking at the clock, it needs a clock, it needs light falling on the clock, it needs my eyes to be working, but more than that, the brain and then the mind to be awake. Finally, the information which comes by the reflected light from the surface of the clock to my eyes through the optical nerves races to the brain centers, from there somehow to the mind, and then the mind must have a thought, a perception, clock perception. And that clock perception is presented to consciousness or is illumined by consciousness, and I have this experience of I am seeing, I'm looking at the time. So this experience of looking at the clock or looking at the time requires all of these, but ultimately consciousness must light up a perception in the mind. I'm calling it a perception in the mind. Any movement of the mind is called a vritti, chitta vritti. And the movement of the mind lit up by consciousness is what we call experience. That's a very precise definition of experience. Consciousness plus a vritti in the mind. Vritti means a movement of the mind. And the movement of the mind could be a perception, could be a thought, like an idea or a memory or a desire or even the functioning of the ego, or self-awareness. I am aware of myself. So that's an introspective inward turn of the mind. That's also a vritti, an activity of the mind. So consciousness plus object, especially consciousness plus a movement of the mind, is required for any experience. Let's go even deeper. Even the activity of the mind may not be required. The absence of activity of the mind is also a kind of experience. When the mind shuts down, in deep meditation or in deep sleep, that's also a kind of experience. Why do I say a kind of experience? It does not have the markers or the characteristics of experience which we have at the moment. I'm consciously aware of experiencing things. I'm not consciously aware of deep sleeping but it is still an experience, because when the mind does start functioning, it registers that there was a period of blankness. So registering the period of blankness is also because of consciousness shining upon the non-activity of the mind in deep sleep. That's also an experience. Deep sleep is also a very peculiar kind of experience, but experience. Now, I think I know where Dimitri is headed with this. He would like to say that then, so consciousness by itself is not enough to have experiences. You need consciousness plus an object, specifically consciousness plus the mind. So consciousness is itself not enough for experiences? Well, that depends upon your philosophical point of view. If you think that the world and the bodies and the minds, all objects, they all belong to an independent real category called nature, or in Sanskrit, prakriti. And then consciousness uses that for experiences. Consciousness is called purusha, and everything else is called prakriti, or material existence. And the combination of purusha and prakriti gives rise to experience. Then you're right. It requires two different things. That's called Samkhya philosophy. So then, yes, consciousness would need mind to generate experiences. But on the other hand, if you look at Advaita philosophy, the Advaita paradigm, then Prakriti is not an independent entity. Prakriti is not something separate from consciousness. It is now called Maya. It is the projecting power of consciousness itself. Though it appears to be an object, it is still nothing other than Brahman. So consciousness or Brahman with its objects, which is nothing but Brahman, appearing as an object. So the universe, body and mind are nothing but Brahman, appearing as objects. And that's enough to generate experiences. A good way of understanding this would be the dream experience. So in a dream, you are there. Maybe you are having a cup of coffee and watching cars go by out of your window. So there are objects. There are cars and there's a window and there's a cup of coffee, and you're not aware that you are dreaming. And you have a body. And so you are an experiencer and there are objects to be experienced, and you might feel, yes, I need objects for experience, something different. Two things are needed. But are they really two? The moment you wake up, you, the experiencer in the dream, and all the objects that you experience in the dream, they are all generated by the same mind, in the dream, the dreaming mind. It generates both subject and object in the dream. Similarly, it is Brahman alone which appears as both the knower and the known, the experiencing subject and the experienced object, and the experience itself. Yeah. All right.
So we go on to Samkhya.
Yes.
This is from Aniruddha Bose from India. In the book Arati Songs of the Ramakrishna Order, translated by Swami Harshananda, it is written, according to Samkhya Vedanta metaphysics, the whole creation emerges out of Prakriti or Maya. What I understand from some of your lectures on Vedanta is that this whole universe that we see is due to the projecting power of Maya, and that the veiling power of Maya prevents us from seeing our true self. Is this different from Samkhya?
So Aniruddha has referred to the Arati songs. Swami Harshananda ji, by the way, he passed just a couple of weeks ago. He was in Bangalore, a very senior monk of our order, very erudite, learned, very saintly Swami. So yes, that book is very popular, where he has translated and introduced the Arati songs, which are sung in all the centers of the Ramakrishna order, including this one here. Yes, the universe is a projection of Brahman through Maya, or a real creation through Prakriti. In Samkhya, in Advaita Vedanta, it is Brahman alone which appears, does not become the universe. But when you say project, this is a Sanskrit word srishti, Brahman appears as the universe. Just as the movie screen never really becomes the people and the places and the objects in the movie, only appears. Similarly, Brahman appears as this world. That is Advaita Vedanta. That's the metaphysics of Advaita Vedanta. Maya projects Brahman as a unity, as a variety, consciousness as its own objects. But Samkhya philosophy says that Prakriti, nature, is independent of consciousness. Consciousness and Prakriti, Purusha and Prakriti, are independent entities, as far as their existence is concerned. There are innumerable Purushas, innumerable consciousnesses in Samkhya philosophy. And there is one Prakriti, nature is one, but it has innumerable products of various levels. So all of these, they interact. And that produces the experience of life. Consciousness and matter interacting. But their existence, as far as their existence is concerned, they are independent. Whereas when you come to Advaita Vedanta, all the consciousnesses are actually one consciousness. There are no markers of difference. How would you mark the difference, the border between one consciousness and the other? There's no way. So it's one consciousness. And Prakriti, nature, is not an independent reality. It is the power of that very consciousness to project itself as its own object. It sees the object within itself. So, yes. Repeat the last question again. Just the last part of it, the question.
What I understand from some of your lectures on Vedanta is that this whole universe that we see is due to the projecting power of Maya, and that the veiling power of Maya prevents us from seeing our true self. Is this different from Samkhya?
So in Vedanta, Maya has these two powers or capacities, the Avarana Shakti and the Vikshepa Shakti. Avarana Shakti is the capacity, the power to veil the truth from us. The truth is that we are Brahman, we don't realize that. The truth is that this world is actually Brahman, we don't realize that. In devotional language, you would say, inside, outside, everywhere there is one God. But we don't see it anywhere, neither inside nor outside. And that is the veiling power of Maya. And the projecting power of Maya is to project that Brahman itself as this world, as this person, as the subject and the object. And Swami Vivekananda said, one alone exists. It appears as nature, Prakriti, soul, that is the Purusha. So one consciousness alone appears as knower and known. Is this different in Samkhya? As I said, in Samkhya, Prakriti is independent. Maya is not independent of Brahman, but Prakriti is independent of Purusha. But Prakriti and Purusha are dependent as far as their activities are concerned. They interact to produce the experience of life. The first step in Advaita Vedanta is basically Samkhya. It is to see yourself as not a body, not a mind. This body-mind little personality, it does not define me. It does not complete, it's not an exhaustive description of what I am. I am something much deeper than this. So I am not the body, I am not the mind, I am not the activities of the mind, the thoughts, feelings, emotions, the personality. I am the unlimited awareness which is a witness to this, and which lights up the mind and the body, making it an experiencer. So this differentiation, this is in Sanskrit, it is this discernment, in Sanskrit it is called viveka. This is Samkhya. It shows us the very great truth, very, very important, an indispensable first step towards Advaita Vedanta, but only a first step. That you are not body-mind, you are the witness consciousness. You are not a body which is born and which ages and it is subject to disease and old age and death. You are not a mind subject to the ups and downs, everyday ups and downs, and waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And transmigration from one body to another body to another body, the Jivatman. You're not even that. You are the awareness in which all of this is taking place. You are the very existence of all of these things. But you are different from all of that. Now, if you stop here, this is Samkhya. But you take one step further. You ask the question, what is the relationship to me? Yes, I understand I am the witness consciousness. But what I am witnessing, that which I light up, that which I illumine, all of this, what is its relation to me? Is it something different from me? Is it something separate from me? Samkhya says yes. Advaita Vedanta, through a chain of reasoning and with the support of the Upanishads, shows that it cannot be so. What we are experiencing cannot be something outside of our consciousness. There's no way of consciousness to come in contact with something outside of itself. So ultimately, what Advaita wants to say is that you, the consciousness, are definitely different from nature, that is Samkhya, but is nature different from you? Water is different from the wave. Gold is different from the ornament. The wood is different from the table. Correct. But is the wave different from water? Is the ornament different from the ornament? Is the altar different from the wood which constitutes the altar? No, it is not. To make it even more clear, in case anybody has any doubt, in what sense did you say that the wood is different from the altar? In what sense did you say the water is different from the wave? In this sense, that there was a time when the water was not a wave. Now the water might appear as a wave, but there will be a time when the water will not be a wave. It could be calm water, it could be water vapor, it could be water in a glass. There was a time when this wood was not an altar. It was in a tree. So, the wood is not the altar. Right now it is. It looks like that. It's the form given to it. Right now water is appearing as a wave. Right now, gold is appearing as that ornament, but gold in itself is not an ornament. So just as gold or water or the wood is different from the ornament and the wave and the altar, but the altar and the wave and the ornament are not different because they cannot exist without their constituent material. Similarly, this entire universe is not different from consciousness. Then you have Advaita Vedanta. So this is the difference between Samkhya and Advaita Vedanta. Advaita takes one step further. After distinguishing consciousness from the material universe, it reduces the material universe back into consciousness. The material universe is absorbed back into consciousness, with leaving only one non-dual consciousness as the only existence. Right.
This question is from Herman Gomez, who's in Colombia. We in the West are more familiar with the terms soul and spirit. From your lectures, I understand that the soul can be equal in Vedanta to the subtle body, whereas the spirit seems more like the pranic part of it, the vital forces. Is it so, or are those identical things? Would you please explain which is the closest concept in Vedanta to those terms and expand on it? In line with that concept, you assert that the subtle body is the one which transmigrates and is born anew in another physical body. Why then did Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj in his teachings say that reincarnation is nonsense, that it is impossible, and refused to talk about it?
All right. So I'll break up this answer to Herman in three parts. First, I'll describe the Vedantic worldview, especially the Vedantic view about the human personality. And then in the second part, I'll relate it to spirit and soul, the word spirit and soul. And the third, finally, quite separately, we'll deal with what Nisargadatta Maharaj had to say. So first of all, how does Vedanta understand the human personality? A trichotomous, three-layered, to put it in the simplest possible terms, there is this physical body, and there is a subtle body, and beyond that there is the Atman, the real I, the existence, consciousness, place, the self, which is the reality. So the Atman, and it has a subtle body, and it has a physical body. So the physical body is not you, it's a body. Even the subtle body is not you, it's a body. And if you actually, for the sake of completion, I must add there's a causal body. The causal body is nothing but ignorance about our real nature. So there's a causal body, the subtle body, and a physical body. And again, none of this is actually theoretical. It's directly observable. Physical body, everybody can observe. What your doctor checks up is a physical body. What you see or others can experience is a physical body. But the subtle body, how would you differentiate the subtle body from the physical body? The subtle body is first-person experience. You experience it yourself. It's private to you. Nobody else can experience your thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories. So those experiences which you have, even the neuroscientists can experience only they can scan the brain and find the neural correlates of your memory, of your thoughts and your perceptions. But your thoughts, perceptions, feelings, memories, that constitutes your subtle body, which everybody experiences. And it makes sense to make this division between physical body and subtle body. From the perspective of our experience, clearly these are two different kinds of things. But the subtle body is also a body, it's not you. You are the witness consciousness of that. In between there is a causal body. So causal body, subtle body, physical body. This is the Vedantic division. Stula Sharira, Sukshma Sharira, Karana Sharira. And they are bodies. And all of that is lit up is animated by the presence of you, the consciousness, which is quite separate from all of these. Now, how do you relate this to... And by the way, the three bodies can also be further analyzed into the 5 sheaths, the so-called 5 sheaths of the human personality. The food sheath is the physical body. Physical body is the food sheath. Stula Sharira is the Annamaya Kosha. The subtle body, there are three sheets there. There is the pranic body, and there is the mental body, and then the intellect body. Or the pranic sheath, mental sheath, intellect sheath. The pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, vijnanamaya kosha. All three constitute the subtle body, sukshma sharira. And then there is the anandamaya kosha, the bliss, so-called bliss sheath, which we experience in deep sleep or in samadhi, which is always there. That is the innermost. Innermost means in the sense closest or subtlest to the Atman. The Anandamaya Kosha, which is the causal body. So this is the structure according to Vedanta. Now if you try to compare it with spirit and soul, so you have to go back to Christian theology and before that Greek theology, Greek philosophy, the Greek worldview. So pneuma, which is literally means breath, that came to be known as spirit. And the soul is what corresponds to the subtle body. So you can see it is a bit of a cross-reference here. The subtle body, in the Vedantic perspective, the subtle body includes the prana, the spirit. The pranamaya kosha is a part of the sukshma sharira. The subtle body, the vital sheath is a part of the subtle body. So in the Vedantic perspective, the spirit, which you call the spirit, the vital breath, the vital air, that would be part of the soul. That's what leaves the body at death. The soul and spirit together. But in modern usage, both soul and spirit, the words in English today, both soul and spirit, as you can see, they're very ambiguous. In Vedanta, this ambiguity is not there. They're very clear references, the very clear meaning of each term. But in modern English, when we say soul and spirit, it refers to so many things. When you say the soul has left the body at death, the soul has gone to its God, you're talking about the subtle body, sukshma sharira. The physical body is dead. The soul has left. That's the individual being, the sentient being, behind which all of it is, by the way, the Atman in the Vedantic perspective. The soul has left the body. Now, in the Vedantic perspective, the prana, which is what is meant by spirit here, is part of that soul. So when the soul leaves the body, the prana, or the vital forces also leave the body. That's what makes the body a dead body, when the life goes out of the body. But in modern English, spirit, the word spirit also refers to, the ultimate reality, the Atman. Soul also refers to the ultimate reality, Atman. There are no other words in English to refer to the ultimate, the real self. So the real self, Atman, sometimes we see it's called the soul, it's called the spirit. So the word spirit has two meanings. Technically, the old Greek meaning, and I think the Latin meaning also, was vital forces, breath. You're right there. The modern meaning, in the general way spirit is used in day-to-day life, it just means our spiritual self. That which goes to God, maybe part of God or stays with God or whatever. And the word soul is also used in that ambiguous way. So for example, save our souls. I commend this soul to God. He was a good soul. A good soul talks about certain characteristics of the subtle body. The subtle body, there are characteristics of being virtuous, unselfish, truthful, and disciplined. This is a good soul. You're talking about the personality, characteristics of the personality. But when you talk about soul and God, you're talking about the Atman, the inner self. So that ambiguity is created by the various meanings of the word spirit and soul. Finally, we come to Nisargadatta Maharaj, who says, I don't know what the reference is, but if he says, and I can quite believe it, that he says that reincarnation is nonsense and impossible. So what is reincarnation in the Vedantic perspective? Or any Indian perspective, except the materialist. whether the Buddhist or the Vedantic or the Jaina, Samkhya, any kind of Indian perspective, the physical body obviously dies. The claim is that the subtle body does not die with the physical body. It was not born with the physical body. It only animates and enlivens the physical body. Once the physical body is dead, the subtle body goes on. It's basically the subtle body leaving the physical body, which is physical death. So the subtle body goes on, and karma gives it newer bodies to inhabit in future lives. So this subtle body, sukshma sharira, this is going from body to body to body. This is called reincarnation, punarjanma. Now remember, all of this Advaita Vedanta, from an Advaitic perspective, which is what Nisargadatta was, a non-dualist. From an Advaitic perspective, all this is a convenient fiction, only to experience the way we look at the world, only to explain that. It's a convenient fiction. It is not to be ultimately taken seriously, because from an Advaitic perspective, from Nisargadatta's perspective, there is only one reality, which is Brahman, the Absolute. So the Absolute or Brahman, pure consciousness, and again, be careful when you read. I know when people read Nisargadatta, and I've read him in English, but he originally spoke in Marathi. So it has been translated into English, and you will find two words, awareness and consciousness. So Nisargadatta says at death, or when the body dies, that's it, that's the end. Consciousness also dies. So a non-dualist an Advaitin might become surprised. What is he saying? Consciousness dies? Isn't it the whole perspective, the whole program of Advaita to prove that consciousness exists, is immortal? It's just a translation problem. Because you will notice immediately after that, Nisargadatta says, so consciousness dies and only awareness is left. So it is basically what we call consciousness. We are translating Chaitanya as consciousness. There it is being translated as awareness. But anyway, just a terminological difference. From Nisargadatta's point of view, this whole idea of a world and a body and incarnation and reincarnation, all of this is a convenient fiction. How can the one reality, the Absolute, which is, for him, it's the only reality. How can that be born? How can that go from life to life? It's an impossibility. And that's why he says that from the ultimate perspective, from his perspective, there is no such thing as reincarnation. And I have told you the story earlier about a monk, one of our monks, who was worried about this question about that the Indian religions say there are many lives, life after life after life. You're born and reborn, reincarnation is there, punarjanma in Hindi or Sanskrit. But the Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they say that there is only one life. You're born, you did not exist earlier, and you die. You will eternally exist afterwards, but there's no more further birth. So, one life or many lives? Reincarnation or no reincarnation? That was the concern of this monk. And very soon people in the ashram became tired of his arguments, so he took his whole dialectics and debate outside the ashram to another ashram nearby. This was in Uttarkashi, in the Himalayas. So that ashram belonged to, there lived a great non-dualist master. So the Swami went there and said, Master, many lives or one life? Punarjanma hai ya nahi? Is there reincarnation or not? And that monk replied, I'll tell you what he said in Hindi and then translate it into English. He said, अरे महात्मा जी, जब एक जन्म ही नहीं है तब पुनर्जन्म काहे का? आप मांडुक्य पढ़िए. Swami, Mahatma ji, when there is not even one birth, where is the question of rebirth? You haven't been born to begin with. How can you be reborn? Go and read the Mandukya Upanishad. And that Swami came back and told me in exasperation, it's no use arguing with these non-dualists. They'll all immediately go to Brahman and Mandukya, and that's the end of the argument. So that's where Nisargadatta was coming from. Yes.
Now this is from Asif Hussain. I have been following you since my college days, and a question has always bothered me. How do I make your teachings relevant in a world full of chaos? one has to deal with the social question of identity, community-based latent isolation, noisy urbanization, and lastly, one's aspiration, which is being glass-shielded by one's birth. How shall I liberate myself from these by following your teachings? Would that not be a part of nihilist escapism?
I'm not sure what you mean by glass shielded, but I get the general tone of the question. So, being a non-dualist, an Advaitin, would it mean escapism? Would it mean nihilism, that nothing exists, or this world doesn't exist? At the very least, the world doesn't exist. And there is so much trouble in the world, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to sit in meditation or just sit quietly and think nothing exists. That doesn't seem very satisfactory. No, Advaita Vedanta is not escapism. I again and again repeat what I heard from, or I read actually from a monk who said in Hindi, वेदांत व्यवहार को मिटाने के लिए नहीं है, वेदांत आपको व्यवहार में निर्बाध बनाता है. Vedanta, Advaita, is not for wiping out your experience of the world. It's not for erasing transactions in the world, erasing activity in the world. No, not for that. It makes you limitless in your experience of the world. Limitless in the sense of you are fearless. You you are completely fulfilled when you go out and interact with the world. So, Vedanta is not for erasing or stopping your experience of the world. There is one kind of spirituality which tries to do that. I will retreat into a mountain cave. I will not interact with society. I'll shut down all interactions because interactions are the source of sorrow. Advaita Vedanta says, no. Interactions are not the source of sorrow. The world is not the source of sorrow. In fact, samsara itself is not the source of sorrow. Think about it. The enlightened people, they lived in this world. Even the body is not a source of sorrow. Even the mind is not a source of sorrow. What is the source of sorrow? According to Advaita Vedanta, the source of sorrow is ignorance. Ignorance about our real nature as Brahman. Once you realize what Brahman is, that I am Brahman, you realize this, then this world and this body and the same mind will no longer be a source of sorrow for you. Will no longer be a source of chaos or trouble. So, Advaita Vedanta does not want you to erase your experience of the world. It does not want you to erase your experience of the mind also. It does not want you to shut down the mind. No. The mind must think. The intellect must understand. And you must interact with the world. But what Advaita wants us to do is to realize what all of this is really. It is Brahman. It is one existence, consciousness, bliss. Having realized that, the same world continues. When you open your eyes after enlightenment, if you have eyes, if you have a body, you have the world also which you can see. If you have a body, then the mind is also there. The mind will think. So all of that will go on. Does Advaita want you to cease interacting with the world? Does it want you to stop dealing with the problems of the world? Absolutely not. That's what Arjuna wanted to do in the Gita, and Krishna told him quite the opposite. That you have to pursue your duty in the world, do your duty in the world, do your activities in the world, but now with a spiritual perspective. Earlier doing it with a worldly perspective, now you do it with a spiritual perspective. You see the iniquities, the sufferings, and the injustice in the world. Why would you turn your eyes away from it? Rather, if you feel motivated to do that, you engage in it, and Vedanta will help you there. Vivekananda gives us some criterion of the truth. So if it strengthens you, accept it as the truth. If it weakens you, reject it as poison. If it is selfish, it is untruth. If it is unselfish, it is true. If it divides and separates, it's untrue. That which unites, brings everybody together, is truth. These are tests of truth. Strength or weakness. Selfish or unselfish. One or divided. Unity or division. These are strength. These are like a litmus test. And based on this, engage in activity. Vedanta encourages you to bring about unity and not disunity. Vedanta encourages you to be altruistic and self-sacrificing and unselfish, selfless. The small self has to be overcome because that's what ties us to samsara. All that Vedanta tells you, your real self is limitless. So that is selflessness. Vedanta gives you strength to engage in your... So you want to be an activist, for example, and fight against injustice in society, if you are motivated to do that. Vedanta will give you strength to do that. I am reminded of Gandhiji, who struggled for India's freedom, who struggled for reformation of society against the caste system, who struggled for education and equity in society, all sorts of things. An enormously busy person. You can just think about, once I saw the complete works of Mahatma Gandhi in Almiras, in the library in our ashram, and I believe he's written more than 100 volumes. The complete works of Mahatma Gandhi comes in more than 100 volumes. Can you imagine a person writing so much in the midst of so much activity? And yet quite serene, quite happy, having all the time for people, peaceful and sweet and loving. How is that possible? It's because he was grounded in spirituality. So whether it's Vedantic spirituality or any other kind of spirituality, it will give you strength and it enables you to engage with the world, not to run away from the world. But notice I have been saying, if you so choose, if it motivates you. Why I'm saying that is, you cannot make it a rule that a spiritual seeker or an enlightened person must be engaged with society. Need not be. It could be like Raman Maharshi, who might stay in a cave all his life, and yet his teachings and his presence radiates across the world even today. Isn't that a great benefit to society? It is a very great benefit to society. Swami Vivekananda said, there might be even other enlightened persons who are not even known. At least Raman Maharshi is very well known now. But who might not even be known. But even that the very fact they existed, and they thought, Swami Vivekananda's words, they thought 5 thoughts for the welfare of humanity, and that penetrates through the walls of their caves and it lives in the thought world, and it will do good to humanity. Nothing can stop it. So, an enlightened person is a blessing to humanity, whether that person is actively active or withdraws from society and stays in an ashram or a cave, but still, just because the person is enlightened is a great blessing to humanity. So you cannot make it a rule. You cannot make it a rule that an enlightened person or even a spiritual person must be an activist. May not be. There's no rule for an enlightened person. Okay.
This question comes from Sri Ram, who's in India. I am learning from listening to you that the ultimate reality is Brahman, but at the transactional level, the world exists. This world borrows existence from Brahman. What does this mean? Even an enlightened being sees the world when he comes down to the transactional level. So can't we say that this world is real and consciousness is also real? Why should something exist in all states of mind to be real? How can subjective experience be used to prove existence or non-existence of an object? Let's say if I don't experience a city which I haven't seen, does it mean it doesn't exist?
All right, there are multiple questions here which Sri Ram has asked. First of all, let me say yes. Just because we don't see something, it doesn't mean that that thing does not exist. That's not in the sense in which Advaita Vedanta says everything is in consciousness. That's the problem. The moment we hear Advaita Vedanta says everything is in consciousness, we think, this consciousness, this is what I'm thinking, so everything has to be in this. Not necessarily. I mean, it's obviously not true. We are sitting here, I'm looking at people, it's a brilliant day outside. Is Central Park there if I'm not seeing it? Yes, I hope it's there. So it's the entire world exists even when I'm not seeing it. The individual person The individual knower, individual subject experiences some objects at any one time. All the other objects still do exist. This is why Shankaracharya attacks the Buddhist idealists in his refutation of different points of view. To the Buddhist Vijnanavadi, the Vijnanavada Buddhists who are subjective idealists. By subjective idealism is meant exactly the kind of question Sri Ram is asking, that they believed everything exists in the mind, that other than the mind there is no independent existence of anything. So when I'm seeing all these objects, they are all in the mind. Even the body is in the mind. Even the brain is in the mind. The mind is the only thing that exists. And the mind is a series of flashes of cognitions called Vijnana. So all that exists is this series of flashes of cognition. And they admit that different series exist in parallel. So we have all different beings, and each of us is a series of cognitions. And the so-called objects which we experience, they are objects, but they are objects in the mind. And there's nothing outside. Very similar to what Bishop Berkeley, the subjective idealist who lived about 400 years ago, he talked about the world is in the mind, and there is no evidence for anything being outside the mind. Shankaracharya did not agree with this. Advaita Vedanta does not agree with this. Advaita Vedanta says, the individual knower, as we know ourselves to be, the object is independent of you. You are interacting with the object. This view in Advaita Vedanta is called Srishti Drishti Vada. The Srishti, the external universe, it exists. It has been created by God, let us say, Saguna Brahman. And we, the individual experiencer, we come and we experience this world. So that's there. It's not subjective idealism. This might be surprising for many people who have heard me speak. No, this is the Advaitic position vis-a-vis subjective idealism of the Vijnanavada Buddhists. That's why Shankaracharya takes a lot of effort, makes a lot of effort to refute the Vijnanavada Buddhist arguments. Vijnanavadi says, everything is inside. The simple question Shankaracharya asks is, if everything is inside, where did we ever get the concept of an outside? I can think of a clock in my mind, and there's a clock outside. Vijnanavadi says that the clock, it only seems to be outside. What is outside is also inside your mind. But then why do I have the distinction of outside and inside at all, if there's no real outside? So things like that. But what Advaita Vedanta is saying, you, the knower, and the object that you know, both are appearances in one underlying consciousness which you are. You, the knower, if you would investigate yourself, you are not just this body-mind. As a body-mind, you experience an external. The moment you are a body, there are external bodies apart from you. We have no doubt about that. But in awareness, the mind appears, the body appears, and everything else experienced through the body-mind also appears. Swami Vivekananda puts it this way. One only exists. It appears as nature, soul. You can put it in more philosophical language. Consciousness only exists, or Brahman only exists. It appears as object and subject. Who is a subject? You are a subject. Does the object exist in me, the subject? No. You and the object both exist in that absolute reality which is Brahman. The one thing that we do not know right now is that we are that absolute reality. What we feel is, I am a subject and here is an object. So the whole battle between the realists and the idealists in the philosophical sense. The realist says, the object exists independent of me, the subject. The object is there, I come and experience it. I see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, touch it. But even if I were not there, the object would still be there. That's the realist point of view. And that's most fashionable in modern philosophy because of the success and power of science. The idealist says, like Bishop Berkeley, that no, only the subject exists, and what you think is an object out there is only existing in your mind, the mind of the subject. So that's the idealist point of view. Both the realist and the idealist are are wrong from the absolute point of view, which is the Advaitic perspective. Subject, object are both appearing in consciousness. You can take a realist perspective and then you as the subject investigate yourself. What am I? You will come to the absolute reality. And from that absolute reality, yes, there everything is in that absolute reality, or is nothing apart from that absolute reality. So that is the answer, yes.
This is from Fahad Jalali, who's in Germany. Does our brain create consciousness? How can I be sure that consciousness is not a product or function of the brain? How can I test to see if awareness is something manufactured by the brain? Some believe that a deeper understanding of brain chemistry will provide the answers. Others look to quantum physics. The minute microtubules found inside nerve cells could create quantum effects that might somehow contribute to consciousness. Some explore computing theory and believe that consciousness emerges from the complexity of the brain's processing. As I understand, the brain is responsible for the content of consciousness. There is ample evidence for a strong correlation between what goes on in the brain and what goes on in the mind. But how can we be sure that the brain is not responsible for experience itself, the capacity for consciousness?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? Does the brain produce consciousness? That is the question. And that's what David Chalmers is called the hard problem of consciousness, and that's what we hear from scientists. And the term has come to be in current usage now, the hard problem of consciousness. What is the hard problem, and why is it a hard problem? Why is it that there's a doubt that the brain produces consciousness, which is where the question is coming from. When scientists scan the brain, we have extraordinarily subtle instruments nowadays. So when you scan the brain, what you see is minute electrical activities in the brain, the blood flow in the brain, the minute electromagnetic activity in the neurons in the brain. You don't see consciousness. If you say the brain produces consciousness, then it must be in a very strange and unique way. When you say something produces something, it should be observable, right? If the productive processes are observable, the product also must be observable. So when you look at the factory producing cars, you can observe the raw materials going into the factory. You can observe the process of production, the raw materials being converted, the parts being put together in the assembly line. And you can observe the car, the final product coming out. That's also observed. But when you observe the brain, you observe processes. You observe blood flow, electrical activity, electromagnetic activity, certain neurochemical activity. All of these are observable. But where is the car at the end? Where is the consciousness at the end? Is that observed? No. Nothing at the end of it. Only thing that's observed is more and more electrical activity. Is consciousness observed? No. Is it observable at all? In principle? No. And that's the interesting thing. Those who are completely reductive, say Daniel Dennett, for example. So Daniel Dennett would say, consciousness is the firing of C fibers in the brain. The firing, electrical activity of certain neurons and certain structures in the brain, that is consciousness. There's nothing more to it than that. That does not seem to be very satisfying. If you say that consciousness is just the brain, without explaining how the brain produces it, don't say that it produces consciousness, it is the brain. Now, it's like a person sitting on the branch and cutting up the branch you're sitting on. You are sitting on conscious experience. All that we have in life is conscious experience. Now, to explain how conscious experience comes, we have to show every step of the way. You can show us the brain, you can show us the neuronal activity, the neurochemical activity, show us the electrical activity in the neurons, and then, next, Nothing. Where is consciousness? So this is called the hard problem of consciousness. There seems to be a jump. As he has said, multiple attempts at trying to explain the hard problem of consciousness. There is microtubules. I think Sir Roger Penrose, who got the Nobel Prize this year, I think, he has proposed microtubules in the nerve cells of the brain, which might have quantum effects to produce consciousness. Might. But there's obviously no evidence of that. David Chalmers would say it is not possible in principle. Whatever is material will produce something else that is material, not the observing consciousness itself. Some have said a computational model. In fact, the latest theories by Tonini, the integrated information theory, the complexity of the activities of the brain generate consciousness. Every other week I see an article in some science journal or some popular website, mystery of consciousness solved. And when you look closely at it, every one of them will have its favorite candidate, microtubules, quantum effects, computational model, complexity of brain activity. Everybody has a favorite candidate to solve the problem of consciousness. But in every article you will see there is a jump. At one point, suddenly consciousness appears. There is no clear link between what was being talked about, whether it is quantum states or microtubules or the computational model and consciousness. This is a jump. I'm reminded of that cartoon, which I had seen quite a long time back. One scientist is writing on the blackboard, probably a graduate student, is writing on the blackboard, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3 are full of mathematical equations. And 5 is again full of mathematics. But in 4, it's written a miracle. And his guide, maybe the professor who's guiding him, is telling the graduate student, it's good, but I think you need to work on step 4. As somebody put it, the miracle of, the biblical miracle of water turning into wine. We understand water, we understand the wine. But how water turns into wine, we don't understand. So we understand brain. And consciousness also we understand directly from our own experience because we are conscious. We understand that. But how this activity of the brain produces consciousness, we don't understand. The philosopher Galen Strawson, who's in Texas, recently Professor Arindam Chakravarti told me that he's actually the son of a very famous Oxford philosopher, Peter Strawson, Sir Peter Strawson. So like father, like son. So Galen Strawson, he has written this article about the sort of tongue-in-cheek, about the hard problem of matter. He says there is no hard problem of consciousness really. What is the real problem here? We have made up our minds that consciousness has to be reducible to the brain because we have sort of made up our minds matter is the only reality. So everything has to be explained in terms of matter, energy, time, space. We have to explain in material terms. Therefore, if you come across something like consciousness, which we are always there, consciousness, we have to explain it in terms of matter. So we have to explain it in terms of the brain. We have to reduce it into brain states, brain activities, and we can't. And therefore we call it the hard problem of consciousness. What Galen Strawson says is, consciousness is most obvious. The first thing that's obvious to us is consciousness. We are aware. Only after that, we are aware of our bodies, of the world. Only after that, we do science and religion and art and politics. All of this is in consciousness. Everything that we do. Even when we doubt consciousness and we want to reduce consciousness to matter, it's still done in consciousness. So he says, consciousness is beyond doubt. Galen Strawson, he says, consciousness is beyond doubt. It's the first thing we start with. There's nothing prior to that. What is doubtful is matter. He says, as we have investigated matter, Over the last 100 years or so, in physics, in particle physics, matter is vanishing before our eyes. Atoms into subatomic particles, electrons, neutrons, protons into quarks, and quarks into superstrings. Where does it bottom out? Is there any end to it? What does it mean even? And they are so incredibly tiny, and so it's beyond human imagination now. Only mathematics predicts it. So matter itself is vanishing before our eyes. He calls it the hard problem of matter. Yeah, so that is the problem. There is really, at this point, there is no clear pathway. The whole field of trying to reduce consciousness to the brain, that field has just stalled. Having said that, obviously there are strong correlates between our conscious experience and neuronal activities. That has been mapped. In fact, that's called the so-called easy problems of consciousness. It's not easy. It requires an enormous amount of training and brain science and technology to map our reports of cognitive experiences and the neuronal activities which correspond to that. So it's a science of correlations. What does it mean? Clearly it means the brain is strongly involved, is implicated in our conscious experience. Vedanta is actually very compatible with this state of affairs. Every experience is consciousness shining upon an object. The objective side of it, so there's an objective side to every experience. When you say what it feels like, the technical term is qualia, the hard problem of consciousness. Everything feels like something. Why it feels like something is because of consciousness. But it feels like something, that like something must be objective. And that like something part of it is contributed by the world, by the senses, by the brain. Even the mind. According to Advaita Vedanta, even the mind is material. So one day you will be able to find the brain and the mind, how the brain and the mind interact. But both are material. What Advaita Vedanta calls consciousness is beyond the mind. It shines on the mind, illumines the mind. What modern neuroscience calls consciousness is basically mixed up with the mind. There is no clear distinction between mind and consciousness in modern neuroscience. Okay. I think we should bring it to a close here. We have run out of time. Thank you, Diane.
Swami.
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ram Krishna Arpanamastu.